Hello, everyone, and welcome again to my newest podcast, Grit Stories of Resilience. I am so happy to have Clark Wright back again. Clark has been on before, as you know, talking about his daughters and the issues they've had in mental health issues in the past. He has talked about his hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro, the Appalachian Trail, which took longer than he expected, Mount Washington, the Grand Tetons. And this past June, he and his family, two daughters and wife, Joanna, went to the Colorado River. And we've got dozens of photographs, not today, but soon in another podcast with Clark. Clark, it's great to have you here today.
Good to see you, Jim. Good morning, Saturday morning or late Saturday.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, I was just thinking when I was in the state attorney general's office long ago, before you went to law school, when Robert Morgan was attorney general, he had an environmental law section, but it wasn't hot. It wasn't on the front burner. It was sort of in the backwaters of the attorney general's office back then. And that's how far we have come, because today it would be on the front page, the front burner, as you will. What made you want to become an environmental lawyer?
Gosh, many things, probably starting with the fact that my mom, especially, was very outdoorsy and was a senior leader in Girl Scouts for a long time. And I did the whole Boy Scouts thing in a troop that was much more oriented towards the outdoors than, just getting merit badges. And then having the wonderful blessing of summer camp opportunities, starting age 5 or 6 at a camp where my dad was a camp doctor and mom served as a nurse, and then on to a much more adventuresome camp, and just fell in love with the quote natural environment. Although I think sometimes we make an artificial distinction. Humans are part of nature too, but it started early.
So you have been an environmental lawyer for almost your entire legal career.
That's correct.
4 decades, I think.
For 42 years. Yes, indeed, if my math is right.
Looking back on that time, what do you think has changed the way we think about the environment 42 years ago, and how we think of it today? Are we more aware of the out of doors and what climate change and these issues are real? Are we more in keeping with wanting to preserve our environment today than before?
Um, that's a difficult question to answer. Simply, I think that science has certainly driven a great deal of knowledge in terms of causes and effects. What we do, we human beings, and how it then impacts our quote, natural or public trust resources: air, water, habitat, wildlife, vegetation, all of those things. And I think certainly everyone across the globe is much more aware of environmental issues than in previous decades. What we still haven't figured out is what to do about it, and at what level of government. And what it all boils down to is the contract we make collectively about what we're willing to give up or limit in terms of our own personal liberties in order to gain for the greater good. And
Yeah.
I've always used an old saying that really does sum it up, and that is that all environmental law has red roots. Um, and what I mean by that is this sort of natural American tendency to, we've been opposing communism and centralized planning and governments for a long, long time. But any environmental regulation is something that's saying we're going to limit what you can do as a private person or business or citizen for the greater good. And the key there is having a collective um, understanding and coming to some levels of agreement. And I'd add one more thing, and I think this is important, Jim. During my entire career, for instance, let's talk about wetlands or the Clean Water Act. Essentially, uh, Congress has not, substantively attempted to join the fray and balance some of these competing interests since the late 70s. There have been some amendments and changes, but the fundamental statutory definitions of wetlands, for instance, have not changed. And what has driven wetlands regulatory law and or quote advancements, some would say, and encroachments, others would say, has been um, litigation in the federal courts, mostly in the form of citizen suits, which under the Clean Water Act, any person who can show they're impacted by water, air, so forth, can file suit to have standards enforced, and a federal judge can issue an order, and many have, that basically ordered EPA and the Corps to be more aggressive. And they took that ball and have run with it in very erratic, often not consistent actions in terms of new rulemaking, depending on administrations and the current political dynamic. I think one other reason wetlands are so controversial and have been for decades is that they represent the transition zone. We kind of know and implicitly accept the idea of regulation by the federal government when you discharge pollutants out of a pipe or a point source into our rivers and streams. But wetlands are often dry, at least as the federal government has been interpreting it for 40 some years. They're dry much of the time. Bottomland hardwood swamps are not, but much of the area that has been subject to regulation in eastern North Carolina and in the eastern coast states is dry most of the time. And it's very difficult to explain to a client that as we stand in the middle of his farm field or a pine plantation, that this is a navigable water of the United States. And that triggered the Sackett case from the Supreme Court, which many people, including myself, don't necessarily like in terms of the resulting impacts on, habitat, aquatic life, stormwater protections, you name it. The list is a long one. But what the Supreme Court said in Sackett, the majority, is that water means water. That for the federal government to regulate, it's got to have a continuous surface water connection with the river or stream, because that's the source of the federal government's authority, the public trust rights and the Commerce Clause. But the rest is supposed to be left to the states. And so that's the great struggle. Wetlands are like the DMZ in the Vietnam War. It's the area, or the area between North and South Korea. It's the area that you fight over because it's not really water and it's not really land. And so it's partially water pollution control and other big issues that federal government may have a role to play, but also it's land use regulation. It's telling people what they can and can't do at the property specific level. And that,
it's always intrigued me, Clark, that politics, liberal versus conservative, has gotten into the environment, which is neither liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, Protestant or not. It's just Mother Nature and the environment. And it seems to me that a lot of folks do not remember or do not know that it was a very conservative Republican president, not a liberal Democratic, not a leftist, but a conservative Republican president who was there at the helm when the Clean Water Act was passed and signed the legislation approving it. That was, of course, Richard Nixon.
Yes.
And it just, if we could get back to where we could discuss the the good points and the not so good points of an issue like that without bringing partisan politics in it, we would probably all be a lot better off.
Yes, and it is, however, a fundamental. It's always going to be a fundamental challenge and friction because it's where your interests get curbed or limited in some non ways
For
for the
the,
best.
for the greater good.
Collectively agreeing on that, I think, is really important. And back to my point about almost all of wetlands law being driven by litigation. Well, sack it. What was that? Litigation, U.S. Supreme Court. So Congress has abdicated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, its role. In our first grade civics, the legislative branch is supposed to make the laws, and the executive branch is supposed to just implement the laws that the legislature has made. But when Congress is incapable or unwilling to act, into that vacuum has flowed decades of citizen suit litigation, and in more recent decades, and certainly poignantly this week, um, the imperial presidency via executive orders and instructions to the heads of the various departments, um, including the EPA.
Yeah. Look, I know that you, in your career, your legal career, you have represented, for the most part, the landowner or the developer in any litigation or mediation that's been going on. Looking back at your career, what do you think you have been able to accomplish as a lawyer, as just as one person? Being in love with the outdoors and as a Boy Scout in your youth.
And from there, yeah,
How do you feel about that?
um, conflicted at times. The the answer I give myself, Jim, which I'm fairly satisfied with, is that when I represent a landowner or a developer or an industry, my goal is to um, often educate them and get them to make changes. I may still want to win a particular case over a particular permit or a particular piece of property, but I I am very pleased with the number of times that I was able to act more as a mediator and or a counselor and or an informant. Something in terms of my career path that had served me extremely well is I spent 5 years in the Environmental Protection Division of the North Carolina AG's office in the late 80s and early 90s. And when I then transitioned into private practice, big time in the middle of the hog wars right off the bat, that's
Right,
when
right.
Smith recruited me. Um, I would be able to tell, even the head of Smithfield Foods that, look, you need to uh, work at cleaning up your act, at least in certain ways. And, it's interesting. Smithfield, of course, now is owned by some Chinese conglomerate. I have no clue about management or anything any longer. But I was very proud at the time. I was heavily involved. Smithfield was able to get all of its company owned hog farms and its slaughter facilities ISO 9000 certified. And what ISO is International Standards Organization, and they have standards for all kinds of things. But um, several decades ago, that group began defining standards for, you know, upper level or better environmental compliance, and companies would have to jump through a lot of hoops and make a lot of actual real changes to get that certification. But it's kind of ironic, the evil empire, with a lot of input put from myself and a senior official named Don Butler. We were able to convince management to do that process. So those kinds of things, or if I have a recalcitrant landowner or developer, I'm very proud, for instance, of had one in the Wilmington area where I was able to resolve it by having him buy 400 acres and deed it to uh, the Holly Shelter Game Lands Preserve. Or or being involved in even the Smithfield hog deal, where $25 million was put in a pot, and kind of an interesting political and legal question, and doled out by the general and his staff or her staff to buy up, riparian corridors or other areas that were deemed important ecologically. So,
Yeah, let me ask you this, Clark.
sort of innovative.
Yeah, yeah. Where are we now? Where are we going the next 10 years? What do you think's going to happen? As you look at North Carolina, are we in a good spot? Not so good? Can we do better? And if so, how?
We're in a very important, hopefully transitional spot. We have a Democratic governor, a Democratic attorney general, but a very right of center uh, legislature with majorities. And I'm not sure if we have a super majority again or not, but it's very close. And so, we see some really unseemly things. Very recently, for instance, the General Assembly reconvened to deal with um, relief for Helene victims in Western North Carolina. Well, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Pro Tem threw in a bunch of provisions designed to further strip the North Carolina governor of power and authority. Just bald, raw politics. And so we're still in a time where there's much too much of that. And it kind of breaks my heart. And, one of the things you've asked me off the air is, what does the future look like? I envision some role as trying to be maybe even a lobbyist, or more heavily involved in something I've dearly loved for decades, which is the land trust movement. EPA and DENR, DEQ, and DWR, all those acronyms, that's, regulatory top down approach. But land trusts, anything a land trust does is a voluntary transaction driven by carrots instead of sticks. You get significant tax benefits, and the the amount of environmental protection and habitat protection and water quality improvements that's been achieved through land trust activities is significant, if not maybe greater, to what's been achieved by EPA and DEQ. And I've served on the board of directors of the Coastal Land Trust for several terms. My pet phrase about land trusts is forever is a long time. If you do that kind of good, that easement or fee simple title transfer, at least as best our system can do it, is permanent protection, permanent good.
You know, it's rare that I encounter a lawyer at the not the end of his legal career, but
Well,
after, after halftime anyway,
yeah, there you go.
after halftime, who still has a sense of hope and optimism. It seems that the practice of law can grind that down a little bit in the day-to-day workings that you do. And I,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think even at working in the environment is one of those complex areas of the law where it's not always clean, it's not always a straight shot, and you have to go one step forward and one step backwards and one step sideways. How do you keep a sense of optimism in what you do?
What's the alternative? I think that one sense would just be me personally. I mean, I tend to be a glass half full kind of person, but what's the alternative? As many say on various bumper stickers, best we know, we haven't got but one planet. And, as we ventured into space, it was interesting to think about Nixon and those years, those early years. What also happened at that same time? Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, but much more importantly, were the first images that the world got to see from outer space of this fragile, simple blue and green ball that we call Earth. And it gave a new perspective, literally and figuratively, and for a good period of time there around that era, you had a social contract consistent belief among the majority of Americans that we needed to do more, and that led to a slew of federal statutes dealing with water and air, groundwater, and hazardous waste, and also dealing with the decision making process, especially if it involves a federal agency.
As you have gone on your excursions over the last at least 20 years of hiking, uh, walking, canoeing all over the world, but particularly in the United States, have you noticed any change or different in the out of doors from when you were a youngster?
Absolutely, tremendous change, and some of it disturbing, some of it positive. On the disturbing side, we're even loving to death the places that we've cared enough about to, preserve in the form of national parks, national forests, state parks, game lands, you name it. And more people are visiting, and yet their budgets have not kept pace. So you have huge, just like we do as a nation elsewhere, infrastructure needs. And now to go to many of the places I would go in my 20s and 30s, where I would just drive, show up, maybe pay a small fee at the entrance. But now, for instance, when we hiked the Wonderland Trail, our group, a couple of years back, we had to participate and win not one but two different lottery um, procedures in order to get a permit to do it. And
To go up Mount Washington, wasn't it?
well, to circumnavigate it, the
Right.
hike, not Mount Washington, but Mount Rainier
Okay.
out west. And it's a beautiful and rugged trail. But my point there was just that, again, in terms of impact of uh, more and more human beings having interest, and that's a good thing. I think when people do interact with parks and national forests and whatnot, it drives it home in a more personal way. Um, the desire to protect those places. The difficulty comes when if you do a poll and say, do I support clean air, clean water, the environment, and improving it, almost everyone will say yes. But if you then ask the question, well, do you support EPA being able to implement stricter regulations on what you can do on your property when it's on or near the water, then it's a different ball game because it strikes closer to home. The key is to figure out how to educate uh, us enough to where we understand causes and effect enough to want to do something about it.
In other words, let me ask you this. As we go forward as a country in the environment, is it necessary to improve the environment, to make it safer and cleaner, that we're going to almost inevitably encroach on some of our liberties that we have held dear for so long? Is that is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And the concept is not all that new. There, if you pull out the old reporters and look at some of the early decades of North Carolina, Supreme Court reported case law and later Court of Appeals, there, way back, you'd have litigation where, somebody started a small industrial operation of some kind upstream, needs water, uh, takes it out of the river, runs it through their processes, and dumps it back in untreated. And then suddenly downstream, some farmers' cows are dying or their crops are not doing well. And trace it back to that person polluting, and there are tort cases that go along those lines from over 100 years ago. The problem it comes in when it's less dramatic. Okay, it's not a pipe that's dumping untreated stuff in that immediately is killing fish or hurting people or their crops or their livestock, but lots lower levels, but the cumulative effect and how much consensus can we get when the cause and effect is more remote. That's one of the difficulty and quote climate change or global warming is the most extreme, if you will, example of that. It's not about what any one person does, but the inevitable cumulative effect, especially over time, is potentially endangering our ability to even maintain viable life on portions of the planet.
Speaking of climate change and global warming, is it your belief or opinion that that is real science, that we are in fact in a situation where we're getting warmer as a planet?
Absolutely, yes, but.
Okay.
And the but is, and many folks who want to see less regulation will point to this, that the chronological record, as best we understand it, of climate and weather patterns over even thousands of years, which we can get some idea of through coring the ice sheets, coring trees, looking at secondary, if you will, indicators, we've had huge fluctuations. We've had ice ages where there was actually, ice coming as far east and downhill as where we live here in New Bern or where you're at up in Raleigh. And then we've had, droughts and famines. And so folks who don't want to deal with that, the realities of climate change will say, well, look, we've had these fluctuations much more dramatic than what you're measuring now. What's the big deal? And I think the answer to that is certainly in part that, well, we've got much better science and much better abilities to connect the dots. And there's some serious research that's been done in the last 40, 50 years that connects a lot of those dots. But it's still, okay, if you accept the science, which there's still some folks who don't, but I think most Americans do in the abstract, what do you do about it? And what can you do about it if, well, let's take an interesting example where we used to be the country with leadership asking others to do more. Well, Trump's now said we're going to pull out of the Paris Accords and negotiating on international treaties and obligations to address climate change. Well, if a major industrial economy like the United States or China or Europe collectively decides not to participate, then why should the others do it? You can end up in a sort of fatalistic, well, if everyone's not going to play, then I'm not going to play. And I think we face a really difficult situation right now on that front.
As an individual, let's suppose not looking at the science, just living your life in New Bern and going around and watching as you have often done, what makes you accept or believe that climate change or the warming change is real?
Well, and again, I can't speak for thousands of years. I can only speak experientially for 67 and a half. But it does appear to me that we are having more extremes. And a lot of people, and I don't fully understand it, but I understand basically the concept. It's not just average temperatures rising, but it's more and more extreme events, extreme cold, like we've experienced recently and still are here in New Bern. There's still snow on the ground, a lot of it, and as well as extreme drought and heat, and of course the cycles of more and more powerful hurricanes that spin up to much higher energy levels much more quickly because of the Earth's oceans being warmer and areas such as the Gulf Stream being warmer still. And that
If
is
you,
big.
yeah, if you were making a speech tonight to a group of non-believers in climate change or warming, what would you say to them? What would you say?
I'll tell you what I say.
Why should they care?
If I'm asked, do I believe in climate change or believe in global warming? The most effective response I think I can give is twofold. One, since when did this become a religious issue? I assume you believe in the law of gravity, or if you're not sure, why don't you jump off this 100-story building and find out for yourself? But then the simple solution, I think, is hey, forget calling it climate change or global warming. Air pollution is bad, just like smoking is bad. If we put a bunch of stuff into the air, it results in more people getting sick and dying. What more do you need beyond that? And and that really illustrates a conundrum. The Clean Water Act has worked fairly well. The whole regulatory process of regulating point sources, sewage treatment plants, often owned by large cities, big business, industries, all of those folks have cleaned up their act, and we have direct measurements that prove it. And we have reduced pollutant loading in many of the nation's rivers and streams dramatically since Love Canal, or catching on fire in the 60s. But air is much more difficult to deal with because it's so diffuse, and it's so you can't see cause and effect nearly as easily, and you have to accept more and more of science as explained to you by those who do research it and measure it. And air moves everywhere. So, the old saying about the solution to many forms of pollution is dilution. For a
Yeah,
long, that was the response in the air. But we've had the Clean Air Act as long as we've had the Clean Water Act. But showing improvement and a cause and effect relationship there has been much more difficult. And so the results have been less less good and less obvious and more politically subject to debate. And really, climate change and global warming are just um, offshoots, if you will, of the air pollution debate.
was a lot of people who listen to or see this podcast were not around or not of a significant age in the 60s, in the 1960s. I know that's hard to understand. I don't understand it at all, but apparently that's true.
Yes.
But what was Love Canal? What was on fire back then?
The Cuyahoga River. The river literally was spontaneously combusting due to the levels, and I can't remember what the pollutants were, but due to the levels of pollution being dumped untreated into it.
Where is the Cuyahoga River?
Um, oh
It,
God,
it in Ohio?
I was gonna say Ohio is what comes to
I think,
mind.
I think that's where it is.
Maybe I can find out here, fairly quickly. And then, of course, other very visible um, uh, event was the Santa Barbara oil spills from some wells offshore, and the very visible image of thousands of birds dying as they're coated in oil, and that got galvanized the nation's attention. And those two events were a big part of the push for enacting the Clean Water Act. And I think we Americans are, I mean, I'll use a crazy example. World War II. We sat and ignored and were isolationist, and uh, sat on our heels while Europe began to burn. And then Japan, located 1,000+ miles away, bombs Pearl Harbor. And when you wake the sleeping giant, then it's amazing what this nation can accomplish when it does have a common purpose. And we've lost that at the present time when it comes to environmental issues. And I hope it doesn't take another calamity to um, get us to form a new consensus to act, but it may. And
Yeah, you remember Winston Churchill's line about the United States will always do the right thing, but only after they have tried everything else.
that's it. And usually only when they've been literally beaten over the head. Another excellent example that reflects our lifetimes would be, and make that beating literally, once all of America could see what was happening to African Americans in the South in the 60s, then um, enacting major civil rights legislation became possible. And then again, when you have an eloquent spokesperson, Martin Luther King Jr., who we celebrated his birthday just ironically on the same day as inauguration this go round. And so, yeah, we are, I think, accurately referred to often as a sleeping giant. But then if you beat us over the head, um, and we do develop a collective consensus, watch out. And I guess that's why I'm still ultimately an optimist, even though it's pretty pessimistic in some respects. Is um, I'd like to think that we will find a way to be more collectively on the same page when it comes to environmental issues. And pardon me, I'll give you a real short version of a very meaningful legal relationship I developed. For several decades, I was the guy defending the pork industry, timber industry, poultry, you name it. And did so again, I think, well, and with results that also improved many of those companies' policies on compliance with environmental concerns. But I get a phone call from Jim Cawley, an attorney with a good small firm in Wilson. And Jim represented, may still, the city of Wilson. And Sanderson Farms was planning a major poultry chicken processing plant in southern Nash County, their neighbor to the north, a very poor and impoverished area. And they were welcoming the economic development with open arms. But this plant was going to be discharging into the city of Wilson's protected watershed. But North Carolina has these watershed protection laws, but they're somewhat toothless. These areas are designated and they have some impact on permitting, but they don't stop anything. So DEQ, under then Governor Perdue, who had a pretty good environmental record in terms of caring about those issues, was just about ready to issue the major permits to Sanderson Farms when Jim Cawley called me. And I don't think I'm being too egotistical to say that I pretty much single-handedly stopped that permitting process. And I did so by gathering together the most unusual coalition I've ever been involved in, but it gives me hope again. We had chambers of commerce. We had the Republican majority city council for Wilson, Republican majority for the county. We had 5 major pharmaceutical industries, because clean water in that area, Wilson actually has a fair amount of pharmaceutical business and industry, and even a tire manufacturing facility, all on board. And we all literally marched up to Raleigh and sat down with Purdue's staff and the folks in the Department of Commerce. And the theme was, this is why I do sometimes have some hope, Jim. The issue was cumulative and secondary impacts. In other words, Sanderson Farms could do a pretty darn good job of treating the waste from its processing or slaughterhouse, where all those chickens would, turn into cellophane wrapped items in the cold place in the meat department in your grocery store. But what about the fact that literally tens of millions of new chickens in large concentrated feeding operation facilities would have to be located within 75 miles? That's roughly the transport circle, that you don't have too much mortality in the trucks. All of those new farms had to be located in the watersheds of the Neuse River and I think also the Cape Fear. And we were able to marshal nationally recognized experts to show that the cumulative effect of all that additional importation of crap, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus into an already stressed system could be the straw that would break the camel's back. And the state did not considered that at all in their environmental and water quality permitting review and stopped them in their tracks. And an interesting twist, Sanderson Farms was then represented by Frank Sheffield, my former law partner at Warden Smith, because he was still with Warden Smith in their environmental section. And so I felt really good about that representation. And it was interesting that I had enough of a reputation as somebody you could talk with about being, if you will, on the other side of where I'd been many times before. The bad part of it is the reality that, well, what did Sanderson Farms do? They relocated to another, poverty challenged area in the state. And so you've still got the same issues, but elsewhere where there was less opposition. It took having a city like Wilson with pharmaceutical industries and the chamber and folks seeing the big picture. I don't know if it would have worked today.
Thanks so much. Let me ask you one last question. We're about out of time, but let me ask you one last question. Where do you go from here? Or do you know yet where you want to go?
I don't.
Either
Let me, one of you, and just briefly, regrets. The only regret I have, but it's a big one, and it's the same one I think way too many successful men and women, more and more now, have, and that is that I didn't spend more time with my wife and my two girls during some pretty critical years. Now, I spent more than many. It's one of the reasons I left Warden Smith, where I was extremely successful, and but I have more flexibility in the smaller firm setting, but not as much in hindsight as I would like. There's a good old saying, don't think there's ever been a graveyard tombstone that read, "Damn, I wish I'd spent more time in the office."
That's right.
It's the reverse. That's my regret. And in terms of the future, trying to find a way to stay involved in environmental issues with maybe less of the stress, which is, I've dealt with some physical and mental challenges because of the very real stress of practicing environmental law in a form where, unlike many environmental attorneys, I mean, I'm litigating, I'm fighting those issues in administrative courts and state and federal courts more than many folks. But I want to continue to be involved. And the two items, or the three things I'm toying with, are taking the certified mediation course and becoming a certified mediator. Potentially, and at one time I had my at one time I was a registered lobbyist. I may try to do that again. And thirdly would be, and I don't know that I would choose to do this or not, but would be to potentially go back um, and work for the state, either as a higher level decision maker within the Department of Environmental Quality or in the environmental section of the AG's office.
Let me tell people one last thing about you that you haven't said that they don't know. There's a song from the Rodgers and Hammerstein movie, South Pacific.
Ah,
And the song is I'm a cockeyed optimist, which I want to say that I've known Clark now for a number of years, and that's what he is. He's a cockeyed optimist. And to prove that, this past December, Clark was going through some unknown health issues and wound up in the local hospital for a number of days and had all kinds of tests, and nobody knew what was wrong.
still
But
don't.
and that's right. But Clark has one other thing that he does really well. He knows how to get out of the bed. He knows how to walk down the hall. He knows how to put on enough clothes that he won't embarrass everybody. And he takes photographs as he walks down the hall. And it was December, and Clark took pictures of Christmas trees. I don't know hardly anybody else that walks down the halls of a hospital as a patient, taking pictures of what they see along the way. And that would be my good friend, Clark Wright. Thanks very much, Clark, for doing this with me today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
we will have a great time soon.
Again,
Walk down some rapids in the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River. Just you wait, Henry Higgins. Just you wait. Thanks, Clark.
and gratitude is the best medicine.
That's right. And thanks to all of you all for watching or listening to this podcast today. And you have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Kim.